Story 1: The Watcher in the Pines. I'd been planning this solo camping trip for months. A week alone in the remote Cascade Wilderness, far from trails and other hikers. My GPS showed the nearest road was 11 miles away. Perfect isolation, I thought. Perfect silence. The first 2 days passed without incident. I hiked during daylight, set up camp before dusk, cooked simple meals over my portable stove. The forest around me was old-growth pine, trees so tall they blocked out most of the sky. At night, my headlamp beam couldn't penetrate more than 20 feet into that density of trunks and undergrowth. On the third night, I woke around 2 a.m. to the sound of something moving through the campsite. My first thought was bear. I'd hung my food properly, but bears don't always care about protocol. I lay perfectly still in my sleeping bag, listening. The footsteps were deliberate, measured, circling my tent in a slow spiral that brought them closer with each revolution. But the pattern was wrong for a bear. Too regular, too purposeful. These were bipedal footsteps, and they stopped every few seconds, as if whatever made them was pausing to examine something. I heard breathing outside the tent wall, inches from my head. Deep, slow breaths that seemed to be analyzing my scent. I reached for my knife, trying to control my shaking hands. The footsteps resumed, completing another circle before moving away into the forest. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. At sunrise, I examined the ground around my tent. The pine needles were disturbed in a clear circular pattern, and I found tracks, human-shaped but wrong. The stride length was too long, maybe 7 feet between prints. And the impressions were deep, suggesting something much heavier than a person. I told myself it was a wandering hiker with an unusual gait. Maybe someone tall and heavily loaded with gear. But I knew I was lying to myself. No one else should be out here, and no hiker walks circles around occupied tents at 2 a.m. without announcing themselves. That day, I hiked farther than planned, putting distance between myself and whatever had visited in the night. I found a new campsite beside a creek, with better visibility in all directions. I built a large fire and kept it burning bright, feeding it wood every hour. I told myself the light would deter animals, but really, I just didn't want to sit in darkness. Around midnight, I heard it again. Not footsteps this time, but a sound I can only describe as knocking. Sharp, rhythmic impacts of wood on wood, coming from the forest maybe 50 yards away. Knock, knock, knock. A pause. Then 3 more knocks slightly closer. I'd read about this phenomenon. Hikers reporting wooden knocking sounds in remote areas, never finding an explanation. Some claimed it was Bigfoot communication. I'd always dismissed such stories as nonsense. The knocking continued, forming a pattern I realized was moving around me in an arc, like something was mapping my position. I threw more wood on the fire, making it blaze higher. The knocking stopped abruptly, replaced by silence so complete it felt oppressive. No insects, no wind, just my own breathing and the crackle of flames. Then I saw it, at the very edge of my firelight. A shape between 2 trees, perfectly still. At first, I thought it was just a trick of shadows, but as I stared, I realized it had form, tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. It stood there for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, and I couldn't look away. My hand found my flashlight and I aimed it at the shape. The beam wasn't strong enough to reach that distance clearly, but I caught an impression of something covered in dark hair or fur, with eyes that reflected my light like an animal's. Then it moved, not walking but somehow flowing backward into the deeper forest, and the normal night sounds resumed as if someone had unmuted the world. I packed my gear with shaking hands. 3 a.m. is a terrible time to break camp, but I couldn't stay there another moment. I hiked by headlamp for hours, not caring about direction, just needing to move. By dawn, I was exhausted and lost. My GPS showed I'd traveled in an erratic pattern, circling back on myself twice. I found a clearing and stopped to rest, collapsing against a fallen log. That's when I noticed them. The trees around the clearing had been stripped of bark at about 8 feet high, leaving pale wood exposed in long vertical gouges. They were old markings, weathered gray, but unmistakable. Something with incredible reach had clawed these trees, marking territory. My hands trembled as I pulled out my satellite communicator. I should call for extraction, I thought. Admit defeat and get out. But I hesitated, pride warring with fear. I planned this trip for so long. I told everyone I was doing a solo week in the wilderness. What would I say? That I got scared of shadows and strange sounds? The decision was made for me. My communicator showed no signal, impossible, since satellite devices work anywhere with a view of the sky. I checked the battery, the antenna, everything. The device was functioning perfectly, but it couldn't connect. As if something was blocking the signal. I heard the knocking again, much closer now. Directly behind me. I spun around and saw it clearly this time. A figure standing at the tree line, less than 30 yards away. In daylight, I could see details I wished I couldn't. It was covered in dark brown hair, standing at least 8 feet tall, with arms that hung past its knees. The face was almost human, but flatter, with a pronounced brow ridge and eyes that held unmistakable intelligence. We stared at each other. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I knew that was exactly what I shouldn't do. Predators chase prey that runs. So I stood frozen while this thing studied me with those 2 intelligent eyes. Took a step forward. Then another. It was moving slowly, deliberately, like it was trying not to spook me, or like it was savoring my fear. I could smell it now. A thick, musky odor like wet dog mixed with rotting vegetation. My legs finally obeyed me, and I stepped backward, maintaining eye contact. The creature tilted its head, mimicking my movement in a way that seemed almost curious. Then it opened its mouth and made a sound, a low vocalization that started as a rumble and rose to something between a howl and a human shout. The sound contained such aggression, such threat, that my bladder nearly released. I ran. I don't remember making the decision. My body just moved. I crashed through underbrush, leaped over logs, my pack bouncing painfully against my spine. Behind me, I could hear it following, not running, but loping, covering ground with those impossibly long strides. It was playing with me, I realized, could catch me whenever it wanted. I burst through a thicket and found myself at the edge of a ravine I didn't remember seeing before, 20 feet down to a rocky streambed. Behind me, the crashing sounds were getting closer. I had seconds to decide. I jumped, trying to land on the mossy rocks below. My ankle twisted on impact, sending a spike of agony up my leg. I rolled, splashed into the shallow stream, scrambled to my feet. The creature appeared at the ravine's edge, looking down at me. We locked eyes again, and I saw something in its expression that terrified me more than its size or strength. Satisfaction. It had herded me exactly where it wanted me. For a long moment it simply watched. Then it turned and vanished into the forest, leaving me alone in the ravine with a sprained ankle, dwindling supplies, and no working communication device. I pulled myself up and began following the stream downhill. Water flows to civilization, I told myself. Follow it long enough and I'll find people. I walked for 3 days, my ankle swelling until I could barely put weight on it. I rationed my food to make it last. Every night, I heard the knocking sounds, always from multiple directions, as if multiple creatures were coordinating their positions around me. Sometimes I'd see shapes moving parallel to my path, keeping pace but never approaching. On the 4th day, I stumbled out onto a logging road. An hour later, a forestry truck found me delirious from dehydration and pain. The rangers listened to my story with expressions that said they'd heard similar tales before and didn't believe any of them. They said I'd gotten turned around, experienced some hallucinations from exhaustion and fear, maybe saw a bear that my panicked mind transformed into something else. But I know what I saw, and I know why my communicator stopped working in that clearing. I found the answer when I finally got it repaired. The technician showed me the damage. Deep gouges across the device's casing, like it had been grabbed by something with incredible grip strength. The damage happened while the device was in my pack, protected by layers of fabric and gear. I haven't been camping since. I tell people it's because of my ankle, which never healed quite right. But the truth is, I can't shake the memory of those intelligent eyes studying me, calculating, or the certainty that I survived not because I escaped, but because I was allowed to leave. Whatever lives in those deep woods, it's still there, still watching the trails and clearings, still knocking on trees in patterns that might be language. And sometimes, late at night in my city apartment, I hear knocking on my window. 3 sharp raps, a pause, then 3 more. I live on the 4th floor. There's nothing outside that window but empty air. But I hear it nonetheless, and I remember those eyes watching me, and I wonder if I truly escaped at all, or if I brought something back with me from the wilderness. Something that hasn't finished whatever game it started in those ancient pines. Story 2. The Lights in Red Creek Valley. I took the backcountry permit for Red Creek Valley because no one else wanted it. The ranger who processed my paperwork gave me an odd look when I specified that location, then asked if I'd been there before. When I said no, he paused, seemed about to say something, then just shrugged and handed me the permit with a warning about the weather forecast. The trailhead was empty when I arrived. Not surprising for a Wednesday in October. The autumn colors were spectacular, reds and golds blazing in the afternoon sun as I hiked the 7 miles to the valley. The trail was well maintained but showed little use, moss growing across sections where feet should have worn it bare. Red Creek Valley was exactly as beautiful as the photos suggested. A wide, flat basin surrounded by steep ridges, with a clear stream running through its center. I set up camp near the creek, far from the trees that crowded the valley's edges. The openness felt safer somehow, though I couldn't articulate why. As twilight fell, I noticed something strange. The forest around the valley's perimeter was utterly silent. No birds settling in for the night, no rustling of small animals. Nothing. Just the burble of the creek and the whisper of wind through grass. I've spent enough time outdoors to know that complete silence is rarely a good sign. It usually means predators nearby, causing other animals to hide. I built my fire and cooked dinner, trying to ignore the prickling sensation on the back of my neck. That feeling of being watched by unseen eyes. I told myself it was just my imagination, amplified by the isolation and the eerie quiet. Around 9 p.m., I saw the first light. A soft, bluish glow appeared in the tree line about 200 yards away. It hovered at roughly head height, motionless for perhaps 30 seconds, then blinked out. I stared at the spot, wondering if I'd imagined it. Maybe a camper's headlamp, I thought, though my permit was the only one issued for this valley this week. The light appeared again, in a different location. Then another and another. Soon there were dozens of them, spaced along the entire perimeter of the valley, all at the same height, all the same shade of blue. They didn't move like fireflies or any natural phenomenon I knew. They simply appeared, hovered, and disappeared, in no discernible pattern. I should have been fascinated. Instead, I was terrified. Something about those lights felt deeply wrong, like they were deliberately positioned, deliberately watching. I let my fire die down, not wanting to be silhouetted against its glow. Then I retreated to my tent and zipped it closed, as if nylon walls could protect me from whatever produced those lights. Sleep was impossible. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the silence, occasionally peeking out through the mesh window. The lights continued their pattern, appearing, hovering, vanishing. And slowly, imperceptibly at first, they were getting closer. The perimeter was contracting. By midnight, the nearest lights were perhaps 50 yards away. I could see them more clearly now. Not solid orbs, but somehow translucent, with darker shapes visible inside them like shadows in fog. And the shapes were moving, writhing, as if the lights contained something alive. I heard footsteps, multiple sets, moving through the grass around my tent in a coordinated pattern. But I saw nothing. No figures, no animals, just those steadily approaching lights and the sound of weight pressing down vegetation. The footsteps circled my tent 3 times, then stopped. Something brushed against the tent wall. I jerked away, my heart hammering. The touch moved along the tent side, slowly, deliberately, as if hands were exploring its surface. I grabbed my knife and flashlight, the beam shaking in my trembling grip. Through the tent's thin fabric, I could see a shadow, human-shaped but wrong, too tall and angular. It paused at the tent's door, and I watched the zipper begin to move downward by itself, tooth by tooth. I acted on pure instinct, slashing at the opposite wall with my knife, tearing through the fabric. I rolled out through the gap and ran toward the creek, thinking water might protect me. Behind me, I heard sounds that still haunt my dreams, voices that almost formed words, speaking in unison, resonant with harmonics no human throat could produce. I splashed into the creek and turned back. What I saw froze me in place. My campsite was surrounded by figures, dozens of them, human-shaped but composed of that translucent blue light. Where faces should be, there were only featureless voids. They stood in perfect silence, watching me with attention that needed no eyes. One of them began moving toward the creek. Then another. They walked with synchronized steps like soldiers marching in formation. I backed away through the water, nearly falling on slippery rocks. The figures reached the creek's edge and stopped, as if encountering an invisible barrier. They stood there, swaying slightly, and I realized they were communicating somehow. Pulses of light passing between them in patterns too complex for random chance. A new sound emerged, a humming that started below the range of hearing and climbed until it vibrated my teeth. The figures raised their arms in unison, pointing at me, and the lights composing their forms intensified until I had to look away. When I looked back, they were gone. The valley was dark except for my dying campfire. I didn't return to my campsite. I spent the rest of the night in the creek, water soaking through my clothes, cold numbing my limbs. I preferred hypothermia to whatever those things were. Every hour, I'd see the lights reappear briefly at the tree line, as if checking whether I was still there. At dawn, I retrieved what I could from my destroyed camp and started hiking out. My torn tent, my sleeping bag, most of my gear. I left it all. I just needed to leave that valley. The trail seemed longer on the return journey, and I kept glancing back, expecting to see those figures following. I didn't, but I felt their attention on me like weight pressing down on my shoulders. It took me 5 hours to reach the trailhead, far faster than my careful hike in. The same ranger was in the station when I returned my permit. He took one look at my face and nodded slowly, as if confirming something he'd suspected. He asked if I'd seen anything unusual. I started to describe the lights, and he held up his hand, stopping me. He pulled out a file folder from his desk, thick with papers. Incident reports dating back 40 years. Every single one described the same phenomena. Blue lights in Red Creek Valley, figures composed of light, voices speaking in human words. 7 people had disappeared from that valley over the decades. 3 had been found days later, miles away with no memory of how they'd gotten there. The other 4 were never found. The ranger told me the Forest Service kept issuing permits because they had no legal reason to close the valley. No concrete evidence of danger, just stories and missing persons cases that could be explained by accidents or people getting lost. But everyone who worked there knew the truth. Red Creek Valley belonged to something else, and humans were only tolerated as long as they didn't stay past dark. I asked what the lights were. He shrugged and said theories ranged from residual energy to interdimensional phenomena to something that simply had no name in human language. What mattered was that they were territorial, and I'd violated that territory. He strongly suggested I leave the area entirely. Not just the valley, but the whole region. The things in Red Creek Valley sometimes followed people, he said. Not physically, but in dreams, in peripheral vision, in sounds heard in empty rooms. Most people reported the phenomena fading after a few weeks. Some never saw them again. Some were never free. I drove for 6 hours that day, putting as much distance as possible between myself and those woods. For the first week, I thought I'd escaped clean. Then I woke one night to see a blue glow outside my bedroom window. I live in the city, on the 3rd floor. There should be nothing outside that window but air and distant streetlights. The glow pulsed 3 times, then faded. It hasn't returned since, but I know it could. Whatever I encountered in Red Creek Valley has taken notice of me, recorded my presence in whatever way such beings record things. I'm marked now, tagged like an animal that wandered into their research zone. Sometimes I dream of that valley. In the dreams, I'm back at my campsite, and the lights are closing in. But this time, I don't run. This time, I walk forward to meet them, and they open up like doors, showing me what lies beyond. I see landscapes that couldn't exist, skies with too many moons, cities built from living light. And I see others like me, humans who didn't run, who accepted the invitation those lights represented. In the dreams, it seems wonderful. In the dreams, I want to return. But when I wake, I remember the terror. I remember the wrongness of those figures, the inhuman quality of their voices. And I know that whatever they offered in my dreams is a lie, or at least not the whole truth. The people who went with the lights didn't find paradise. They found something else, something that wears the shape of wonder to lure in the curious. I'll never know what they really wanted from me that night. Maybe they were simply observing, studying the strange human who stumbled into their domain. Maybe they were testing me, measuring my worthiness for some purpose I can't fathom. Or maybe they were hungry, and I escaped only through luck and the protection of running water. All I know is that Red Creek Valley is still there, still beautiful in photos, still issuing permits to unsuspecting hikers. And the lights still appear at night, patient and eternal, waiting for the next curious soul to stay past dark and learn what lurks in those ancient woods. Story 3. The Stalker on Blackwater Trail. The Blackwater Trail cuts through 73 miles of wilderness, following an old miner's route across Montana's remote backcountry. I'd planned a 5-day solo hike, resupplying at a cache point on day 3. The weather was perfect, early September, cool but not cold, clear skies. I felt strong and confident as I left the trailhead, pack loaded but manageable, legs fresh. The first day passed uneventfully. 16 miles of steady hiking brought me to a campsite beside a glacial stream, water so cold it hurt to drink. I set up camp, cooked a freeze-dried meal, and fell asleep watching stars through the tent mesh. This was what I'd needed: solitude, silence, disconnection from the noise of civilization. I woke on day 2 to an odd discovery. My boots, which I'd left outside the tent as I always did, had been moved. Not far, just repositioned about 3 feet away, set neatly side by side. I might have thought I'd misremembered where I placed them, except for the tracks. Something had approached my tent during the night, examined my boots, and left them in a different spot. The prints weren't like anything I recognized. Vaguely canine but larger than any wolf, with claw marks that suggested something with serious digging capability. I checked my food bag, still hanging safely from its branch, and looked for other signs of intrusion. Nothing. Just those strange prints and my relocated boots. I told myself it was just a curious animal, maybe a bear or large cat investigating the unfamiliar scent. I continued hiking, making good time across ridgelines that offered spectacular views of the surrounding peaks. But throughout the day, I had the persistent feeling of being watched. Not the vague paranoia of isolation, but a specific, focused attention from somewhere behind me. I stopped several times to look back along the trail. Never saw anything, but each time I resumed hiking, the feeling intensified. By afternoon, I was checking over my shoulder every few minutes, hands straying to the bear spray on my hip belt. That evening, I reached a designated campsite near a rock formation called Devil's Tooth, a spire of granite that jutted above the tree line like a crooked fong. Other campers had used this site recently. I found traces of old campfires and some litter I collected to pack out. The presence of other humans, even absent ones, should have been comforting. Instead, it made me wonder what had driven them away from this perfect location. I set up camp with meticulous care, arranging everything so I'd notice if anything was disturbed. Then I did something I rarely did. I gathered deadwood and built a large fire, planning to keep it burning all night. That inexplicable dread had settled into my gut, and I wanted light and heat between me and whatever I feared was out there. Around 8 p.m., I heard the sound, a vocalization unlike anything in my experience. Starting as a low growl that climbed in pitch and transformed into an almost human scream, then descended again to end in a series of coughing barks. It came from the forest about 100 yards away, echoing off Devil's Tooth to create a disorienting stereo effect. Mountain lion, I told myself. They made strange sounds, but I'd heard mountain lions before, and this wasn't quite right. There was something intentional about it, something performed rather than natural, as if whatever made the sound was announcing its presence deliberately. I fed the fire and waited. An hour later, the sound came again, closer this time and from a different direction. Then again at midnight from a third location. Whatever was out there was circling my campsite, calling out each time it completed a quarter of the circle, marking its territory, or perhaps marking me as something within its territory. I didn't sleep. I sat by the fire with my knife and bear spray ready, feeding wood to the flames every time they started to die. In the darkness beyond the firelight, I occasionally caught reflections. I shined from something watching me, positioned at the limit of my vision. When I aimed my flashlight toward the reflections, they vanished, only to reappear minutes later from a new angle. At 3 a.m., it entered my camp. I didn't see it arrive. I was facing the fire, and it approached from behind. I only knew it was there because the back of my neck prickled, and I heard breathing, deep, steady inhalations that sounded eerily close to human rhythm but with a wet, rasping quality. I turned slowly, afraid that sudden movement might trigger an attack. First, I saw nothing. Then my eyes adjusted, and I realized something was standing just outside the fire's glow. A shape that blended almost perfectly with the darkness, visible only as a slightly denser shadow among shadows. It stood upright on two legs, tall enough that I had to tilt my head back to see where its head should be. We stayed frozen in that tableau for seconds that stretched into subjective eternities. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. My hand tightened on the bear spray canister, but I didn't raise it. Some instinct told me that aggression would be the worst possible response. The thing moved, not toward me, but sideways, circling to position itself between me and my tent. It was studying me, I realized, evaluating me with intelligence that was obvious even in its alien movements. This wasn't an animal acting on instinct. This was something that thought, that planned, that made decisions. Then it did something that sent ice through my veins. It mimicked me. It tilted its head at the same angle mine was tilted, raised one limb in a rough approximation of my arm position, even seemed to lean its weight onto one leg as I was doing. It was showing me that it understood I was like it somehow, another thinking being rather than simple prey. The mimicry was so uncanny, so wrong, that I finally moved. I raised the bear spray and shouted, wordless, primal sound meant to convey dominance or at least unwillingness to be victimized. The thing reacted immediately, dropping to all fours and retreating with shocking speed. In seconds, it had vanished into the forest, leaving me alone with my racing heart and the dying fire. I abandoned the campsite before dawn, not even bothering to pack properly. I just stuffed everything into my pack and started hiking by headlamp, desperate to put distance between myself and whatever had visited in the night. The trail stretched ahead endlessly, and behind me, I heard that vocalization again, the growl scream bark that seemed to follow my progress. Day 3 should have brought me to my resupply cache, but I missed the turnoff in my panicked flight. By the time I realized my mistake, I'd added an extra 5 miles and was completely off my planned route. Worse, I was running low on food. I'd have to ration carefully to make it to the next marked waypoint. That night, I didn't set up my tent. I found a sheltered spot beneath an overhanging rock face, wedged myself into the narrow space, and waited for dawn. The vocalization came 3 times during the night, always from different directions, always at that 100-yard distance. It was hurting me, I realized, pushing me away from the trail, deeper into unmapped wilderness. By day 4, I was lost. My GPS showed I'd wandered into an area my maps didn't cover, following what I thought were game trails but might have been nothing more than gaps between trees. My food was gone. My water was running low. And that thing, whatever it was, continued its relentless pursuit. I began finding signs of it during daylight hours. Trees with bark stripped away at heights no bear could reach, showing claw marks that gouged inches into the wood. Cairns of rocks arranged in patterns that seemed almost like language, marking what might have been territorial boundaries. And prints, everywhere prints, always positioned where I'd see them, reminding me I wasn't alone. On the 5th day, delirious from hunger and exhaustion, I stumbled into a clearing and found something that shattered my remaining rationality. It was a structure not natural but built, branches and logs arranged into a rough shelter, with more of those rock cairns positioned around its perimeter. And inside the shelter I saw bones. Large ones, from deer or elk, and smaller ones that might have been from different animals, or might not have been. I ran again, not caring about direction, just needing to escape that clearing and its implications. Something lived here, something that built shelters and collected bones, something that hunted with intelligence and purpose. And it had been herding me toward this place for days, like a shepherd guiding livestock to slaughter. I don't know how I found the old logging road. Pure luck, or perhaps whatever pursued me finally decided to let me go. A truck found me collapsed beside the road, barely conscious, my gear scattered where I dropped it. The logger said I was 30 miles from the Blackwater Trail, in an area that hadn't been logged in 40 years. They asked what happened. I tried to explain the stalking, the vocalizations, the structure in the clearing. They exchanged glances and got quiet. Finally, the older logger told me I wasn't the first to come out of those woods with such stories. Every few years, someone emerged speaking of something that walked upright but wasn't human, something that hunted with terrifying intelligence. Most people dismissed the stories. Hallucinations brought on by exhaustion and fear, they said. Misidentified bears or other wildlife. But the loggers who worked these forests knew better. They'd seen the structures, found the bone collections, heard the vocalizations echoing through valleys at dawn. They knew something lived in the deep woods, something that avoided humans most of the time but occasionally took interest in a lone hiker. Usually, those hikers were allowed to leave eventually. Sometimes they weren't. I never returned to complete the Blackwater Trail. I've barely gone hiking at all since then. The experience broke something in me, that fundamental sense of safety that lets humans venture into wild places. I now understand with visceral certainty that we're not apex predators. Not in those deep places where civilization's rules don't apply. Something else holds dominance there. Something old and patient and utterly alien to human understanding. It let me go, but I don't know why. Maybe I wasn't worth the effort. Maybe it was full from another meal. Or maybe it simply enjoyed the fear, the chase, and knew that letting me escape would spread that fear further, keeping other humans away from its territory. Whatever the reason, I survived. But I'm marked now, changed by those 5 days of being prey. Sometimes, in moments between sleep and waking, I hear that vocalization again, the growl-scream bark that haunted my flight through the wilderness. And I wonder if it's just memory, or if whatever stalked me on the Blackwater Trail still maintains its interest, watching from whichever shadows can reach me even here in civilization's bright lights.